Hey everybody, and welcome to Community Canyon. This is a joint Planet Coaster project organized by Coaster Connection and CoasterBots, and featuring outside of these guys and myself, also Loakin and DigitalDan. The way that this works is that we have one park file and we each get the file for a little bit and our own area to work on, and what you're seeing at the moment is some of the stuff that the others have built, because as it happens, I'm actually the person who's last to work on this, and after my turn, it should all be finished up. Now, I also have to say, getting this episode out has been a little bit of a rocky journey, partly because of poor planning on my part. It happens that during my week of being able to work on this, I had already planned a trip to Paris for almost the entire week. So that was a bit unfortunate, and then I've also had some technical issues with Planet Coaster and my computer that just made this a lot harder. If you see some time-lapse lag spikes, and yes, they even happen in the time-lapse, that's how bad it was, then that's just my computer acting up. Despite the fact that this is sped up 12 times, sometimes the game just completely froze for a while or went down to 5 FPS inexplicably. I'm not sure. It made working on this a little bit hard, and I'm mostly just hoping that the time-lapse doesn't look too bad as a result of it. Anyway, let's actually talk about the coaster, because this thing is really interesting, and honestly, I am really glad that somehow they pushed me into trying this this kind of concept, or even coming up with it, because really, I was mostly inspired by what DigitalDan had done before me, because he created a swinging mine train coaster, but did something completely unique with it, namely actually taking the track and inverting it, going through lie to fly elements as if it were a free fly or 4D coaster, which is really cool because with the way that the swinging carts work, they will stay upright. So even though the coaster goes through inversions, the carts don't actually invert all the time, but it also does do a trick where they actually go upside down. Either way, it's really cool. It's like a really extreme SNS freefly coaster, and it mostly inspired me to try and take one of the in-game coaster types and do something completely different with it, to try and come up with a new kind of coaster type that doesn't really exist in real life. So, besides that, another major inspiration for me for this coaster, as some of you guys may have guessed if you're a really big coaster nerd, is Vertigo in Walibi, Belgium. Now, Vertigo was a very infamous coaster, I should say, that only existed for a few years and is regarded as one of the biggest failures in roller coaster history. Not necessarily because it was a bad experience per se. From what I've heard, it was actually a really fun coaster, and if I'm looking at POVs and off-ride footage, it actually looks really good. Basically, the way that the coaster worked was it was a massive suspended coaster that was suspended on big supports and crossed huge stretches of space without additional supports next to it. And it's almost like a hybrid between a cable car and a roller coaster in the way that it flew between these different supports, which is also very fitting because the coaster was manufactured not by a roller coaster manufacturer but by Doppelmayr, which is an Austrian cable car manufacturer, and as it happens, actually the, de facto market leader in cable car technology. It's a company that has bought up many influential cable car companies throughout the years, such as Garaventa and Vonro, where Vonro, I think, is actually quite known because many of their cable cars are actually some of the original cable cars that you find in theme parks across the world. Many old cable cars from Disney parks, for instance, in the US, and things like that. So it's a company with a history that goes back way back, and it's even very much linked to theme parks. The new Disney Skyliner that was built in Disney's Disney World is also a Doppelmayr cable car. But yeah, I'm getting a little bit off topic. Anyway, Doppelmayr developed Vertigo in Walibi, Belgium as a kind of prototype roller coaster that's really somewhere between a cable car and a roller coaster. And although it was a fun experience and it got pretty good reviews, it always had lots of technical issues, was broken down a lot, and in the end, after a few years, it was decided by the park to just remove it instead. And I think Walibi Belgium, took quite a while to recover from that, because if you go back into their history, for quite some time around that, they didn't really do any major investments, and the park kind of stalled. And really, only in the last couple of years have they started to recover from that. If I can go off topic a little bit again, I do have to say that I really like the direction that they're taking. I went there last year, and I think it's turning into quite a beautiful park. It's a really good family park, as opposed to Walibi Holland, which is a lot more thrill-based and less good-looking, I would say. Walibi Belgium actually has some pretty charming theming and some damn good dark rides. So yeah, it's a cool park, but unfortunately Vertigo didn't really turn out to be the success that they had hoped. Although I do respect their courage in trying something completely new, because that coaster was really unlike anything anybody had ever seen, and I'm not sure if we're ever going to see another coaster like it again. But for what it's worth, I wanted to try doing something similar in Planet Coaster, and so the way that Vertigo was laid out was very much influenced by the way that it was supported as a suspended coaster. It had these big towering steel structure with helixes around it, and between that long stretches of straight track that kind of flew down like a flying fox. So that was interesting. It almost looked like a zip line, the way that it moved between these giant structures. And so I figured, what if we take the in-game suspended coaster and put it on these kinds of supports instead, which notably is a bit heavier, quite a bit heavier than the much more cable car-like zipline-esque coaster that Doppelmayr had built. But I'm not an engineer, and I don't know how well this could work in real life, but the idea for this coaster was really just to take a suspended coaster and suspend it off of these kind of supports and make it look structurally sound enough. And honestly, I think it even kind of works with the layout of this coaster, because the helix nature of how these supports work means that you get lots of spaces between these towers where you really swing from one curve into the other. And because the cars are swinging, it gives a really good swing on that S-bend and some really interesting transitions between the curves. So I'm a big fan of that. And also, I think it just looks kind of cool, which brings me to another reason why I was inspired to build this. I was actually having a discussion with CoasterBot on Twitter recently on a post by Cupcakes and Coasters about whether coaster tracks break immersion. And the whole thread in general, I forgot the exact topic of it, but it was generally about how we have these theme parks with very densely themed areas and very immersive environments. But then roller coaster track and roller coaster mechanics can kind of break this, and so very often highly themed theme parks try to hide their roller coaster parts as much as they can, but it's still something that can kind of break the immersion. And I think it would be really cool to see roller coasters that are really themed to what that track are, or that somehow incorporate that track into the theme. I know that at the time Cupcakes and Coaster's position on the whole matter was that it wouldn't be necessary and it doesn't really matter. But personally, I just think it would be really cool, like a new creative avenue for the roller coasters, Imagineering, to see how the design of the roller coasters themselves could be featured into design of a whole themed area, which I think is not too ridiculous of an idea. I think there's one roller coaster type which does this in real life, which is the Mine Train coaster, which obviously it's themed after a mine train, but not just that, the track itself looks like, train rails. Of course it's a little bit different, but I think it's the case where the track of the roller coaster itself is the most immersive, and there are still a lot of hidden parts to it as well. I know that Disneyland, for instance, tries to hide the locations of their block breaks as much as possible. I highly recommend checking out ElToroRyan's newest video on Big Thunder Mountain, which is a really cool in-depth look into exactly how big Thunder Mountain works, that kind of reveals all of the behind the scenes stuff and reveals just how much behind the scenes there is. There's still a lot that's hidden with these kinds of coasters, but the parts that you do see of the coaster and that you really just have to see because it's what you're riding and it's all the mechanical stuff that has to be visible, all of that is very much themed. And so for me at least, it's a ride type that's more immersive than other coaster types, because when you're flying with a B&M flying coaster through some kind of rocky terrain, like in a Happy Valley Park in China, you have these beautiful environments and just awesome settings, but you can still see all of the B&M track around you, the steel supports that create this machine, and it's something that you can't really get around very easily, but it still breaks the immersion a little bit compared to a mine train, where you can really imagine that you're on this wild train ride and all of the track that you see is roller coaster track, but it's also part of this immersive idea that you're on a wild train ride. So I think it's really cool and an idea that could be played with more. Now, the challenge is, of course, what kind of coasters can you actually incorporate into certain themes? At the time, my idea was that in a steampunk theme, for instance, and honestly, I think steampunk is the kind of theme where you can go the most crazy with roller coaster tracks and make it a believable kind of contraption within the narrative of the themed area. But I was basically thinking of some kind of suspended transportation system, a little bit inspired by the city in BioShock, or by something that my friend Jazz made in City Skylines recently, where he had some floating cities and suspended monorails in between them as a transport method. Suspended coasters could really fulfill this kind of steampunk, futuristic travel machinery role, which is, of course, a little bit ridiculous, but within that whole suspense of disbelief, I think it's very much a setting where the coaster design itself can be part of the theming. So for this, I'm not going quite that far and really building a floating steampunk city, but in line with the steampunk theme that DigitalDan has created for his area just before me and next to me on the map, as well as the mine theme that was established at the start of this map, I am kind of going for this. So my idea for this, and yeah, just hold on to my thoughts, because I'm gonna go a little bit off topic on this, I guess. But my idea was cable cars are a transport technology that's very much linked to mines as well. In fact, arguably the first cable car that ever existed, which was in Gdansk in Poland around the 17th century, I believe, was actually built for a very similar function. It was built to transport soil to some part of the city that was being expanded. And while at the time this cable car used ropes and horses to power the whole thing, which makes it a lot less efficient than today's cable cars, it's the first time that massive amounts of rope were hauled onto supports and dragged material to one place, from one place to another. And it's still something that happens with a lot of mines. Actually, Doppelmayr still creates ropeway technology to transport goods in mines and excavation sites, and some other companies do as well. It's something that's still very relevant. And yeah, I figured it could fit the mine theme that this whole area is very vaguely alluding to. And also in line with that, I would have to say that I'm starting to work on the station here, and stuff is kind of going slow because the menus aren't really being as friendly as I'd like them to be, and there's a lot of testing, what kind of pieces I am using. So this is some stuff that I'm really gonna have to upgrade my PC for, because this is not gonna be very doable in the long run. But yeah, I'm just gonna deal with it here. But I was really inspired by a particular mine in Belgium, which is called Winterslag, which has a beautiful hallway with ironwork supports holding up this triangular roof, and lots of brickwork and decorations on the side. So very vaguely inspired by that, I'm building the station building here. Really not going too much into detail here, keeping everything quite simple. In part because, well, I wanted to finish this whole venture in a timely manner. But still try to use as much of the kind of Flemish revival aesthetic that I could see, which is not per se the aesthetic of the mine. It's a little bit more fancy than mine buildings were, although there are some very fancy mine buildings, but I just really like Flemish revival. It's a really cool kind of Renaissance revival style that you find all throughout Belgium, and you find some very similar styles in the Netherlands as well. Features lots of intricate masonry and cornerstones, and I just love it. Lots of different colors. It's a style that was really popular around the end of the 19th century, and I know in the Netherlands a similar style was led by Pierre Cuypers and led to buildings like the National Museum at the Rijksmuseum and also the Amsterdam Central Station, which are very similar buildings, but you can really see these sorts of elements of the style in there as well. And of course, what helps is that the Winterslag building, as an industrial mine building, is a very open space that has no supports in the middle, which kind of makes it perfect for a coaster station. I'm really just taking all of my ideas from there here and creating a similar kind of big iron girder structure to hold up the roof and create this large space underneath it where the station can sit, especially because suspended coasters do need quite a bit of space for the station as well. With the only caveat that the station is a bit too long. At the time when I was building the station, I still had 8 cars on the train. I later brought this down to 5 cars, partly because 8 cars felt too heavy for the support structure, even though I'm not an engineer and the support structure is probably not that on point anyway. I felt that 8 cars really would be asking too much of the suspended track here. But also I simply didn't have space for a larger transfer table at the end of the ride. So something had to give. I did want the transfer table to realistically be able to actually transfer trains in and out so that I could run 2 trains. So I'm going with 2 trains of 5 cars instead, which in any case is much better than a single train of 8 cars. But yeah, it's probably not the very best situation for throughput anyway. But yeah, keeping this station very simple and not really adding too much to it. It's just a rectangle with 2 entrances, one on the front, one on the back, with the exit path actually being on the back, which is maybe not the most practical solution because that is where the most amount of space is to create a queue path. I just always like to have my entrance on the front because it very clearly demarcates where the entrance is at, and then also have the actual path into the queue somewhere in that area as well, so that it's kind of clear where you have to go if you want to enter this coaster. And the front is a little bit more detailed than the back, but there's not too much to it. Some simple spires, but I'm not going overboard here and creating my own spires like I sometimes like to do as well. Now, skipping forward a little bit, and yes, I made a bunch of cuts in these time lapses just to make everything a little bit more sped up because I'm trying to fit it all into a single video. But yeah, going forward a little bit, I'm working on a small building just to house some of the horrible cattle pens that are going on in this queue here. Please ignore what a terrible queue this is. Normally, I'm always a man of very themed queues, and I hate boring queues. Honestly, I think it's something that theme parks in general should put more attention towards. I mean, you really are spending most of your time in a theme park, especially on a busy day, standing in queues or walking from one attraction to the next one. So put some effort into it. But yeah, I'm going against my own mantras here and just making this a very simple switchback building with a kind of industrial roof, those sawtooth kind of roofs. Not too much going on, it's very simple, but I think in the layout of this whole area it just kind of works, and I had to fit that queue in somewhere. Might as well do it over here, because well, I couldn't really come up with anything that would be much better. In a perfect world, I would love to do like more of a Baron 1898 queue with maybe even a bigger connected building going through some kind of garden beforehand, but I didn't really have the time to try any of those more advanced ideas, so I'm keeping this one very simple and just trying to go as much as I can with the kind of industrial / mine theme that was established beforehand. So yeah, not too much going on here. So let me actually skip forward to something else that was happening later on. I decided to build a little lake over here, and well, I think it's something that at least gives you some interesting shots, because at this point I was really just building in a way that I figured would look cool for the final cinematic footage. Don't hate me for this, please. It's just something that you gotta do sometimes. I was just really thinking about how the coaster would look off-right and figured, hey, a pond over here might be really cool. Also added this lake on the other side of the layout, which is really to get some good camera angles. Honestly, I think it's fine sometimes to build in ways that, you know, you're already picking some camera angles and thinking of them and trying to build around that as well. It's something that I do a lot. It's something that I don't really admit to or talk about a lot. But still, I often build in a way that I think would work out for a video. And, you know, it's not something that can be really bad as long as you're trying to stick to some realistic layouts as well. But sometimes it's good to try and set up some shots, because otherwise, you know, you build your things and then it's just a complete surprise what it's going to look like. And especially from the vantage points of paths, you should always, I think, check it out as much as you can while you're building stuff, see what it looks like and see how it all comes together, and based on that either keep going with it or try to change the composition of it a little bit, just so you're not really surprised about what the coaster looks like once you're actually down there and looking from an actual perspective at it, rather than just the aerial perspective which you're normally looking at it from when you're actually building it. Now, for all of the foliage around here, I'm really keeping it very simple, adding some very basic rock work and some bushes here and there, but nothing too out of the ordinary, I would say. In the middle, I couldn't really think of what I wanted to do specifically, but I just knew that I wanted to keep this space very open, because I like the fact that, you know, on these suspended sections of track, you're spending a lot of time in the air without any supports. And especially if you have any paths, you know, directly underneath that, you get that interesting interaction where from the coaster you're flying over these paths, which is cool, and when you're standing on the paths you can see the coaster directly above you. I'm not sure if this is enough distance of a clearance to like require coaster nets. I decided not to install any coaster nets because I figured it was high enough up there, which kind of doesn't make sense, because if any objects do fall out, they're just gonna go faster. But then again, how do you stop that at these heights? But yeah, I just didn't want to actually add any coaster nets because it would totally ruin the look of this whole area and the openness of the space. Not to mention that I do think that these are very difficult cars to throw things out of. In real life, of course, you always want to make sure that when a coaster comes close to paths, you want to make sure that any kind of loose items falling out don't accidentally hit on somebody's head, because if you get hit with a phone in your head that travels at 100 kilometers an hour, it's probably going to be very lethal or super damaging at the very least. But with these kinds of very enclosed cars that the suspended coaster has, I think it's fine. I'm not even entirely sure why I'm going on about this so much. People probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't talked about it. But yeah, it still irks me a little bit that there aren't any coaster nets. I just really wanted the space between these giant pillars to remain as free as possible, to really give you that feeling of how the coasters are flying over these suspended tracks from basically every vantage point. And then for all of the foliage around it, I'm also trying to mix a little bit with the foliage that the surrounding areas have. So just taking some trees from some of their stuff and filling it in with some oaks. This honestly is very similar to how I would always used to fill in the maps on Coaster College, which I also try to do the very fast and easy way, just creating these tree lines by sinking a bunch of trees into the ground and covering it up with different species of trees as well. There's really not too much to it, but I think especially from a distance it works well enough to make it feel as though you actually are somewhere in a forest and in a real life location rather than just a random sandbox in Planet Coaster. I do think it's interesting though that we're on this, red sand western style map, but everybody decided to change the color of the ground to grass. Maybe it's just because that red sand just doesn't really work for most themes except for western, but it's something that was just kind of striking. And finally, for this final stretch, I'm just embellishing the area with some extra scenery. Even though it's not really themed, I still wanted to add some fountains and some basic gardening and everything. But really, the focus of this whole build is just on the coaster itself. So not going too in detail here, just trying to make sure that no area stays untouched and doesn't totally bring you out of the immersion of the whole area. But there's something that I do want to show before I move on to the cinematic footage and the POV, which is one other thing that I actually built beyond just these simple gardens, which is a flat ride. I eventually ended up choosing to build a troika here because I think it works out the best to actually preserve the view of this. And I'll be totally honest, I built this whole thing because I think it would look cool. There's not really any other purpose to this flat ride other than just working in the general layout of this area and providing a really cool shot. But honestly, I think it worked out in the end, and it's just something that I wanted to feature because all of the other areas in the park do have at least multiple rides or, some kind of flat ride focus as well, which of course I'll just say as a reminder you can find in the playlist as well. But really, for my purpose, all of the focus is on the coaster itself, and this is just something that helps provide a little something extra and one cool shot that I had in mind actually for the video. Also, I just noticed again one of these spikes. For anybody who is, really concerned about this and about to comment about it, I know I need to fix up my computer, but at this point it's more of a time thing than it is a money thing because I am able to afford an upgrade. I just really need to find the time to get into it, and at the moment my whole life is a bit uncertain and kind of wonky, and I really don't have the time to look into this kind of thing. Another problem is that Planet Coaster is the only game which is especially problematic. With Planet Zoo, of course, Koala Zoo is a lost cause, but Parkitect still runs okay and I can still play City Skylines. So I don't know what's up with Planet Coaster, but it's just running especially terribly, and eventually I only got it to work decently through NVIDIA GeForce. But whatever the case, it's something that you shouldn't be too concerned about, I think. It'll be fine. That sounds totally like something somebody would say who knows that things aren't fine. But no, by that I mean I'm gonna look into it at some point in the future. But right now, there are too many other things that I need to worry about. Anyway, that's not something that I want to bore you with. Let's get down to the final section of this video, so I can actually show you the cinematic footage and the POV. So after building this little fountain thingy here, it's finally time to show you what the ride looks like. So with that all said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video, whatever that may be.